My first memory is sitting cross-legged at the bottom of the garden at 52 Bourne Road, Coventry, with the girl next door, digging up dirt with a couple of teaspoons and eating it. I liked the taste. I can still feel that grittiness in my mouth. I was 2 years old and wanted to know what dirt tasted like. I didn't eat the worms, but my mother told me off all the same. I never did it again. It was in 1934. We lived on an estate belonging to the GEC where my father worked as a foreman electrician. There was me, my mother, my father, both Liverpudlians, my elder sister, Bobs, whose real name is Constance, and my Uncle Ian, who wasn't really my uncle but a pal of my father's. They'd met in the trenches during the First World War, and he'd come to live with us long before I was born. My father was a vain man. I often caught him looking at his fingernails to make sure they were clean, or if he passed a mirror, stealing a glance, then smoothing his hair. He had a lovely thick head of black hair. My mother suspected he was a bit of a womanizer. She also thought he was a mean man. On the few occasions when she went with him to the local pub, he brought rounds for everybody. My mother would ask him for a port and lemon, but when they came home, my father would promptly take the cost of the drink out of her housekeeping. My mother and father didn't get on, but they loved me. I always felt I had two fathers, my real father and Uncle Ian, who was as fond of me as I was of him. I liked being fathered by two men. I always seem to have had two men in my life. Two fathers, then husband and lover, later husband and son. I remember the warm feelings Daddy and Uncle Ian gave me. Uncle Ian and I used to make pobs, a nourishing dish made with bread and milk and sugar, and if we were lucky, a raw egg beaten into it. It was nice sitting cross-legged with Uncle Ian, eating pobs together. When I think of my father, I remember the smell of his breath, which at weekends was usually beery, and the smell of steaming porridge which we ate together. He'd sit me on his knee in the garden and sing the old Flanagan and Allen song, Underneath the Arches. A lovely memory. My father smelling of beer and singing, with our little dog Smudge sitting at our feet. I always felt very close to my father. I often thought my mother and sister were on one side of the family, my father and I on the other, with Uncle Ian the neutral element. I was too young to take sides, but when my parents rowed, I banged on the wall and screamed at them, hoping they would stop. I can't remember a time when they didn't quarrel and fight. They were quite serious rows, usually about money. Once my mother flung the dinner at him and it hit the wall. On another occasion, when my mother and sister were doing the ironing during the height of a row, the iron went where it was not meant to go. I seem to remember my sister's arm was burnt. I was obviously a belated accident. I think my father was very disappointed I was not a boy. When I was 6 weeks old, my mother took me back to Liverpool to see the rest of the family. My father was given instructions to have me registered as Diana. He may have had a few jars on the way to the town hall because he wrote Billie on the birth certificate. Years later, when I'd be about 5, he strode in with a budgerigar in a cage, saying to it, "If you lay a bloody egg, I'll break your blasted neck." I think my father was desperate for some male company. I can only assume the budgerigar was female because 3 weeks later the bird had flown. The family came to the conclusion my father objected to having another female foisted on him. Though Daddy apparently adored my mother, if they'd been a couple today, I feel sure they would have divorced. My mother just didn't feel the same for him that he felt for her. But in those days, people in my class couldn't afford to split up. You made your bed, you had to lie on it. My mother was a hopeless housekeeper. She rarely paid bills and invariably had to rob Peter to pay Paul. I grew up being afraid whenever the doorbell went, ready to duck down in case it was someone demanding money, the rent collector or the milkman or the gas man. Even now I still sometimes pretend I'm not in, and I don't have a bell at our cottage. No meal was ever ready on time. Mum spent most of the time daydreaming, or as she called it, meditating. I can see her now in our Bradford wartime home, wearing a faded maroon dressing gown, hardly the most elegant of garments, standing with her elbow on the mantelpiece and staring out of the window towards the Pennines and Ilkley Moor. She would stand there in front of the kitchen range, which was in the sitting room, holding a cigarette at an angle, quite a bit out to her left, but with enormous delicacy, like a great lady. In the other hand she held the flap of her dressing gown up to her hip, as if picking up the folds of a beautiful evening dress. She would stand like this for hours, daydreaming. Meanwhile, the cushions would be raised too high on the settee because Mum used to stuff old newspapers and bits of clothing underneath them, anything she couldn't ram into a drawer and out of sight. This was her idea of tidying up before Daddy came home. On the sideboard, Mum kept lots of little boxes. Later in life, whenever I came home to visit, one of the first things I would do would be poke around in them, sorting out all the familiar bits and pieces, all smelling of Mum's cigarettes. For decades afterwards, those oddments gave me a great feeling of security, a feeling of home. I still have them. Mum was a very good-looking woman. She'd worked as a milliner before her marriage and played the violin, certainly well enough to entertain troops during the First World War. She also sang Alice Blue Gown to them. But she had lost her voice because she said she smoked too much. But she still sang Alice Blue Gown to us in the kitchen, holding her hands in front of her like an opera singer, with palms turned upward, one hand inside the other. That was part of my earliest musical education, together with Tommy Dorsey playing the 1 o'clock jump and the Andrews sisters singing The Sunny Side of the Street. Mum felt she'd been cut out for better things. When she meditated, she thought about her illustrious lost past. She was a descendant of a very old Lancastrian family, Le Norrie, aristocrats of French origin who lived in Speke Hall, a Tudor mansion outside Liverpool. The Norries had married into the Buccleuch family, descendants of Charles II and Nell Gwyn. My mother talked incessantly about her legendary background. It's all in the annals of history, she would explain to all who'd care to listen. She would regard herself as a throwback to the glorious times of Speke Hall, a bit like Edith Sitwell and the Plantagenets. I think Mum hoped she would marry above her station and be taken back closer to where she felt she rightly belonged. My father, however, thought it all a lot of rubbish. Yet as I grew up listening to Mum's endless stories of our great days at Speke Hall and all the historical names, I began to conjure up visions of living in this house once I'd grown up and having a little French maid all of my own. But when I did grow up, I forgot about Speke Hall. Although half a century later, I'd meanwhile had a son named Matthew Norries, just in case, I was acting in Beckett's Rockabye and Footfalls on 42nd Street in New York. In a theatre next door, David Whitelaw and Alvin Epstein, both marvellous actors, were performing a different Beckett bill. One of the props they used was a huge old tome called The History of English Houses. One day I visited the set and took a closer look at that page. It had a picture of the Tudor mansion with text describing the Norries family of Speke Hall exactly as my mother had told it to me all those years ago. Thinking back now, I remember Dad sitting me on his knee, probably after a row with my mother, and saying to me, "Bill, you're the only woman I've ever really loved." At the time, I found that very nice, but I also felt that perhaps he shouldn't have said that. It was a bit disloyal, I thought. At this time, I lived in the shadow of my sister. When I was 5, I went to the same primary school. I hated being taken away from my parents, and my first day was dreadful. I was only reconciled to school because it was a mixed school, and I fell in love with a boy called Walter. We played chase in the playground, and I leaned up against the school door trying to look like Diana Durbin singing, "My own, let me call you my own," hoping that Walter would think me attractive. So there I was, 6 years old, draping myself around this door, thinking, I bet I look attractive, and hoping that Walter could hear me and even stop and listen. When I look back at Walter, who must have been all of 7 at this time, I don't see a little boy at all. Even now, I see a man much older than me, someone really mature and knowing. I remember running around the playground, showing off, tucking my skirt up into my knickers, doing handstands up against the wall. I did my handstands at the drop of a hat. As soon as I got outside the school gates, I'd cartwheel all the way down the street and round the corner till I got home. Neighbours would say to my mother, well, we've just seen your Billie coming home from school, on her hands, as usual. I was always anxious to please. As a child, I was thought to be a dumb little curly top who had to be patted on the head and not taken seriously. I looked with such envy at my sister. She was clever, attractive, bright, and a woman. Bobs had won scholarships. I was hardly university material, though words like that were never used at home. There was never any money in the house. That was the root of all our problems. My cousin Ray used to nick sweets. I stole bits and pieces from fruit sellers' stalls, but I never stole anything from Woolworths that was considered proper stealing. I grew up in a tradition in which husbands and wives did not get on, where violent rows were the norm, where women could only feel happy and relaxed when the men were out of the way. Oh, mothers and their bloody sons was one of Mum's favourite sayings. According to her, all mothers doted on their sons. She looked down on them for this and considered them silly creatures. Curiously, neither my mother nor my sister ever had sons. My mother had 2 daughters, so did Bob's. John, my stepbrother, had 2 daughters. Robert, my second husband, had 2 girls till he met me. Yet when my son was born, the only boy in the family, my mother instantly loved him, and did so until the end of her days. I suspect little Matthew was the only male she ever loved unconditionally. She died when Matthew was 13. What a pity she never knew him as a man. It might have changed some of her ideas about the male sex. My mother claimed she only married my father because of his marvellous teeth. They were, she said, the reason she loved him. Although I don't believe my mother ever really loved my father at all. At most, she became infatuated with him when they met. Ironically, after they married, my father had a road accident. He was slung on his face and dragged a couple of 100 yards along the street, and it knocked out every tooth in his head. I was just 7 when the war broke out. We were still living in Coventry, which became the most bombed city in Britain. It shattered my life forever. After the age of 7, I was never again to live a normal family life. I was evacuated to a little village called Barford in Warwickshire. I didn't want to go. We were surrounded by factories in Coventry, Roots, Armstrong, Siddeley, etc. And although not 8 years old, I knew that there was a good chance that all my family could be killed. I didn't want my family to die without me. I was evacuated with my school. We were put on a bus, and my mother came down to see me off, and poor Mum was in great distress. I had a label with my name on it round my neck and a gas mask over my shoulder. I had to take a rolled-up blanket with me, and Mum stuck an orange and an apple into each end. We arrived at this unknown village and were taken to a school where we were shepherded into a big classroom. No one explained anything. None of us dared to speak. I was petrified. We were taken out 2 by 2. Where were they going? Where were they all disappearing to? I thought I'd never see them again. When my turn came, I was teamed with a girl called Betty, who I didn't like and who didn't like me. I'd always been really horrid at school to this little girl, hiding her hat and gloves behind the lavatory door so that she'd get into trouble at home. I don't think I was a very nice little girl. I thought it must be God's revenge that I came to be paired off with Betty in this strange village. Betty and I were taken into another classroom, and a woman called out, "Right, Mrs. Court, here are your 2. Mrs. Court came up and led her two little girls away, one of them being me. Everyone laughed and applauded as though we were prizes in a raffle. For me, it was a strange new world. Betty and I shared a bed, and I wet it every night and hoped Mrs. Court would think it was Betty. Mrs. Court had told us that Hitler ran the garage down the road, and if I didn't behave myself, he would get me, and I was sure that bedwetters were the top of his list. Whenever I had to pass that garage, I'd put my head down and run like hell, hoping he wouldn't see me. Betty soon went back to Coventry. She probably got fed up with my bedwetting, and so did Mrs. Court. I was unhappy and longed for home. On the radio, Vera Lynn used to sing, "Good night, children everywhere. Your mummy thinks of you tonight. Lay your head upon your pillow. Don't be a kid or a weeping willow." Every time I heard this song, I howled. I sat in front of the radio with tears streaming down my face, thinking, I must look so pathetic. If my family could see me now, they'd have to take me home. Mum came to see me at Mrs. Court's whenever she could. Every time I begged and begged her to take me home, and one day during a visit she told me, "All right, Bilkins, next time I come, I'll take you back with me." But she didn't. Not then, anyway. I told myself I would run away, and one day I actually did run away. Shortly after that, all hell broke loose. Coventry was Coventrated, as the Germans call it. Now Coventry is twinned with Dresden, a city that we devastated. I remember the ack-ack guns roaring until they ran out of ammunition, the screams of planes and bombs. Then the Germans started machine gunning the streets. My father's only concession to the bombs whistling down on us was to lean his head a little to one side in case the centre light, a typical 30s lamp which was always full of dead flies, fell down. One afternoon, Mum and Bobs and I were at the pictures and the air raid siren sounded. Mum wanted desperately to get us home, but this wasn't allowed. We could hear almighty explosions nearby. The warden bundled us down the stairs of the big city centre shelters where people crowded in, clutching parcels of food and drink. It soon became packed. I remember the smell of sweat and beer. I curled up in a corner. Mum was saying, "Never again, never again. We're never going to the pictures ever again." By now I was 8. Proper schooling had become a thing of the past. Our school was hit. I walked to the school building where I'd left some knitting. I picked my way over what seemed like mountains of debris, collecting bits of shrapnel as if they were shells at the seaside. Later we kids would compare the best bits and do swaps. There was a 6-week period during the war when we were without gas, electricity or water. Although the water came out of the tap, we were not allowed to drink it because of the possibility of typhoid fever. "Corpses in the pipes," I heard someone say. There was another side of the bombing in Coventry. When I was aware of it, I realised for the first time that people were not all good and brave. Things had become such a mess that the Coventry authorities abandoned some rationing, and to my child's eye, it seemed that suddenly people were coming in from everywhere, driving up in cars and swarming over the shops. They'd heard rumours that there was no longer any rationing in Coventry. I found this disgusting. People invading our ruined city, which had no water, no gas, no electricity, no ration books, all making a beeline for the shops. It was the first time I felt disillusioned with grown-ups. It was not the only thing that shocked me. A few times I watched enemy aircraft coming down in flames. People would get very excited. They'd shout things like, "Hooray, hooray, one more chalked up." But there were men in that plane, I thought, being burnt to death. No one seemed to care. And yet I was morbidly curious, too. I wanted to look inside the burning aircraft at the dying men to see what they were doing. I was sent to Liverpool from the frying pan into the fire. I didn't stay with the Whitelaws as I had expected, but with Auntie Iris, another unrelated aunt, an old school friend of my mum's. She and her husband, a master of the local Masonic lodge, lived in a leafy suburb. They were, it seemed to me, posh. They had a proper 3-piece suite and 2 sitting rooms. They had ornaments, and the furniture was always polished. I started to feel ashamed of my own background. I thought I didn't fit in. That feeling has never really left me. Even when I came to live in a big house in London, Northwest 1, with my second husband, and was well off, I had a nagging feeling at the back of my mind that I couldn't ask people back. The place wasn't really good enough. Christmas was coming. I knew I looked shabby. I also sensed that not nearly enough was being contributed for my keep to make me look respectable. I'd overhear whispered conversations like, "They really should get Billy a new winter coat," etc., etc., etc. Christmas arrived, not even a Christmas card. I understood my parents' problem, but the knot in my gut became a little harder. I sensed a lot of last-minute hurrying and scurrying on the part of Auntie Iris and Uncle Alf. It was Christmas Eve. I woke up in the middle of the night. They'd put a big balloon at the bottom of my bed. I saw a horrible face staring at me, a face with ears on it. I was so frightened, I pulled the sheet over my face. Oh, please, I thought, let it be morning soon. There's something horrible at the bottom of my bed. Daylight came. Uncle Alf and Auntie Iris had managed to fill a pillowcase with all sorts of things. Most of them seemed babyish to me. There was a tin with coal in it, and a funny little horse, about 2 inches high, on a little stand. I felt resentful and humiliated at having to play act Christmassy oohs and ahs of delight, and all I wanted to do was cry. I would have felt much better if they'd said, "Look, Billy, it's wartime and difficult to send anything from Coventry." But nobody said anything. That's when I realised that sometimes one has to sing for one's supper. You have to try and present the face that people want to see. I still tend to do this, but I don't do it as well as when I was little. When Liverpool started to be bombed regularly, Auntie Iris got worried. Soon I was put on another train, on my own this time, to Bradford, with another label stuck round my neck. I went for a walk to see where I was. The first little shop I came to was a baker's, and I couldn't believe my eyes. In Coventry and Liverpool, it had been difficult to get even bread. Yet here, I suddenly find myself outside a shop without a long queue, and the window was full of bread and cream cakes. Cream cakes! I'd landed in fairyland. Daddy started to look for a house in Bradford where the whole family could live. Uncle Ian would have to stay behind because of his job, which made me feel very sad. Neither Mum nor Bobs were looking forward to this move. Had my sister's deepest longings of becoming an actress been realised, she would by now have been studying at RADA in London. Just before the war, when Bobs was 16, she'd been given an audition there and was accepted. They were willing to pay her fees, but not her keep. It was out of the question for my parents to find the money. Mum often spoke about this and how upset she was at not being able to let Bobs fulfil her ambitions. She consoled herself with the fact that the war had broken out a year later, so Bobs couldn't have gone to RADA anyway. Unable to have a theatrical career herself, Mum seemed determined that at least one of her daughters would succeed where she had failed. Such ambitions as I might have had were still dormant. I certainly wasn't aware of wanting to be an actress, and when I did go into the theatre, it certainly wasn't because I'd seen Peggy Ashcroft play Juliet. I'd been to the theatre only once, to a pantomime. I was 5, but I still have the clearest memory of Sandy Powell singing, "If Father Christmas lost his whiskers coming down the flue, what would the poor kids do? Toodle-oodle-oo. He would run like Donald Duck with all his toys for you, if Father Christmas lost his whiskers coming down the flue." I've heard that song only once, 57 years ago, but I still remember every syllable, every inflection of Sandy Powell's voice. The lights on the stage were dazzlingly bright. Sandy, who was probably about 40, appeared to me to be a lovely old granddaddy figure. In 1941, the Whitelaws settled down in a council house, 3 Ruskin Avenue, Bradford. I see Mum and me sitting on an upturned drawer at the side of a big old iron kitchen range, waiting for the furniture van to arrive. Bob's had to stay in Coventry a bit longer. Her legs had been badly cut by glass during an air raid. Shortly after arriving in Bradford, she joined the RAF. Poor Mum knew nobody in Bradford. She missed Bob's. She became depressed. She and Daddy had dreadful rows. She hated the house. Paradoxically, Bradford seemed to me a haven of peace after the horrors of Coventry and Liverpool. A few months after we arrived, my father complained of pains in his legs. He was sent to Bradford Royal Infirmary for some tests. And when I think of this time, I can still see Dad's back as he walks away from the house, so carefully dressed, a blue and grey scarf around his neck. I remember his vain, slightly self-conscious walk. I didn't know then I would never see him like this again. I was not allowed to visit him in hospital. They said I was too young. On visiting days, I waved to him through the window, and I always had a hollow feeling in my stomach. The doctors and nurses told my father he had a bad case of bronchitis. In fact, he had lung cancer. When they sent him back from the infirmary, he arrived home on a stretcher, carried by 2 ambulance men. All the neighbours were watching from behind the net curtains. Daddy looked so thin, his teeth much too big for his mouth. We had 8 steps going up to the front door. The ambulance men had trouble manoeuvring the stretcher up those steps. A couple of times they almost dropped him, and Daddy tried to hold on to the sides of the stretcher. He was wearing pyjamas. I was standing on the 4th step, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. He was trying hard not to cry. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared straight ahead. I didn't know the word then, of course, but I had total empathy with him on that long climb up to the front door. He'd been robbed of his dignity. I was 9 years old, but I understood. For a while, he rested on the settee in our sitting room, and then he had to stay in the front main bedroom, which he was never to leave again. Mum slept with him in that room, either in the double bed or in a chair. They still managed to row. There was life in the relationship yet. I slept in the next room. The walls of a council house are very thin. I could hear everything. "This can't be bronchitis," he'd groan. "It can't be." Listening to this, I knew for certain that it wasn't bronchitis, though I'd been told nothing. I wondered then, and I still wonder, why people treat children like idiots. During those awful days, I felt older and wiser than I do now. Everything was sharp and clear to me. My mother didn't want me to know Daddy was dying. Very well, I'll pretend. I pretended with all of them. "It'll be spring soon," I'd tell Daddy at his bedside. "We'll go for nice long walks when it gets warmer." I knew damn well there would be no more spring walks with Daddy. I noticed that the mirrors had been taken out of Daddy's room. He looked dreadful. I longed to share my anxieties and tears with my mother and sister, but I couldn't. I wasn't supposed to know there was anything amiss. I had to turn the other way, play my role of happy little Billykins. Most children are anxious to oblige. I was getting quite practiced at playing my assigned part. Daddy started to beg me to find him a mirror, any mirror. So I would walk downstairs, count up to 100, then come back and tell him I couldn't find one. And I knew he never believed me. I thought it was dreadful that an intelligent man should not be allowed to deal with his own death. Yet would I have handled it better? My father had great faith in Advocar, a sort of eggnog with brandy. He thought that if he could get hold of some Advocar, he'd get better. In wartime, alcohol was scarce. I went to every pub in the area, right up the Haworth Road. I could be very stubborn when the occasion demanded it, something that was to stand me in good stead 30 years later. It was like something out of a 19th century novel. I banged on pub-side doors or walked into public bars pleading, "My daddy is dying, Advocaat will make him better. Have you got any?" I got a bottle. At night I could hear my father scratching at his blankets and moaning to himself, and I'd put my head under the covers and say over and over again, "Please God, let Daddy be dead in the morning. I wanted him to die because I loved him." There came a time when I was no longer allowed to see him. He looked terrible. Mum thought he would frighten me. One day Mum asked me if I would like to spend the weekend with a neighbour. "Oh yes," I replied enthusiastically, thinking, this is it then. I would rather have stayed with my mother and sister. I wanted to be there when Daddy died. I would have liked to have shared my tears. Apart from that, I felt no emotion at all. So I was packed off. It was spring. I remember I had nits in my hair. I waited. I thought, perhaps the doctor will come and give an injection. I knew doctors sometimes did that. Yes, I thought, that would be for the best. On that Sunday afternoon, Mum came to see me. Here it comes, I thought. We just sat there. After a while, she said, "Billy, I'm afraid Daddy's dead." "Yes, Mum," I said, "I know." She looked at me blankly for a few seconds, as if I hadn't understood. Then she left the room. I didn't cry, and that was that. We never did share our tears, alas. Back at school, I felt strangely excited. There'd been a girl called Audrey in my class. I remembered that when Audrey's father had died, she'd cried all through prayers and assembly. The headmistress had mentioned how sad it was that Audrey's daddy had died. At the time, I thought, gosh, how strange and different Audrey looks suddenly. So when I went back to school with a note from my mum saying my daddy had died, I kept thinking, I wonder if I look different now. I wonder if I look the way Audrey looked, even though I wasn't crying at all. I thought, I must look different now. The other girls are probably thinking, what must Billy be feeling? What I actually felt was that I was the centre of attraction. And I still had nits. Oh, the shame of it. Strangely enough, I found it easy to cry over make-believe games. Yet when my father died, whom I loved, I couldn't shed a single tear. Lots of good things happened to me as a child, but it's no good pretending I had a happy childhood. I've heard people say, oh, she's only a child, she'll get over it, children don't mind. Well, children do mind, and they don't get over it. I minded like hell my father having cancer and dying horribly. I minded the air raids and the fear they instilled in me. I minded being sent away from home. I minded the curtains being drawn and living in a darkness lit by one sad electric light bulb. I minded having no money and having to fight to keep myself warm and clean. I minded the struggle to light a fire and being surrounded by dirty dishes. As for the facts of life, as sex was called then, they were handed on to me by my mother. There was no such thing as sex education in our school. As my breasts were starting to grow, my mother would remind me, "There's safety in numbers, you know," which meant having 2 or 3 boys around at the same time, going around in a gang, was the best way of preserving one's virginity. One day, Mum sent me off to the chemist with a note to get some sanitary towels. She showed me the note and said, "Now, Bill, do you know what these are for?" And I said, "Yes, Mum." And she said, "Oh, well, that's all right then." That was the end of my sex education. Or not quite, because when I got married for the first time, Mum drew me aside and said, "Now remember, Bill, a slice off a cut loaf is never missed." After 40 years, I'm still trying to work out what she meant. Life in Bradford improved when Mum met the man we called Jumbo. His real name was Tommy Moore. When he moved in with us, Mum tried to kid me they were married, but I knew damn well that they weren't. The wedding came much later.